On Rebuilders today, we are looking at what's coming up in the month of October.
The reason we're doing this is I cannot think of another time where so many consequential things that are going to affect the culture, the world, history going forward are happening in 1 month. So we're going to dig into all of them today, give you an understanding of what's happening and perhaps where we're going.
Yeah. Well, you can head to rebuilders.co to find out a bit more and to subscribe to our mailing list, and we look at some of the resources and just have a bit of a chat about the episode as well. So let's jump into it. Welcome to Rebuilders. My name is Daniel and I'm here with Mark Sayers. How are you this morning?
I'm well.
Yeah.
We're very well colour coordinated today.
I know. Yeah, for our audio listeners, check out the YouTube video because we are got this kind of maroon
matching
navy hue vibe going.
Yeah.
Now you'll notice that I'm not Liddy. Liddy is not.
What?
Shocked. Liddy isn't with us today. She's at home resting. So we're thinking of her. But today we are going to do something not different. We've done it before, but we're just going to take a little bit of a shift from our often discipleship or leadership focused episodes and look at the news and what's happening around the world, what's coming up that we should be aware of, and there's ways to think about that. So Mark, do you want to just kind of set this up for us?
Well, I think, as you've rightly pointed out, that, what we do on Rebuild is talk about leadership and discipleship, where we look at institutions. And we thought with maybe Liddy off today, we've got an excuse to talk about a bunch of things happening. But it just struck me last week how, with everything going on in the world, October into early November, I can't remember a time when so many consequential things in the world, which could set the direction for the sort of next part of world history, are happening.
Yeah.
And in many ways, it seems like a bit of a pivot point in grey zone for regular listeners. And so I wanted to call this the hunt. The hunt for grey October, the hunt for grey zone October, playing off the Tom Clancy novel / movie with Sean Connery,
which I unfortunately have not heard of or seen.
Have you seen any Tom Clancy movies?
Oh, is there some more? Is Jack Reacher? Is that Tom Clancy?
No, he did Jack Ryan.
Jack Ryan.
So Harrison Ford was your classic,
okay.
Character. There was Clear and Present Danger and all that. They're actually quite fascinating movies because they're sort of like he was sort of almost that post-Cold War, who's the enemy? Like in one, it's the sort of, Colombian sort of narco gangsters. And then another one, it's like what's post-Russia.
But is he kind of riding through the Cold War times?
He was writing sort of the end of the Cold War.
Yeah, okay.
Fascinating fact. He wrote The Hunt for Red October, and the Navy began to, or the FBI began to or Navy intelligence began to surveil him because they thought he possibly was stealing secrets because it was so accurate.
Oh, right.
But I think he was like an insurance salesman who sold insurance to old Navy commanders or something. And so he got all this intel. But then bizarrely, all these sort of intelligence, military industrial types end up loving his books.
Yeah.
Because that's what the sort of character is. Like Harrison Ford's like a mid-level CIA guy. So then by the end of it, he was just rocking around Langley CIA headquarters just with open access as Tom Clancy and sort of advising them on foreign policy and stuff. But I think you're thinking
in the books?
No, this is in life. This is in real life.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Yeah. And but I think you're also thinking that Jim from The Office was recast in Jack Ryan, which is not Tom Clancy. It's written so, but it's. I watched a bit of it, but just hard to take Jim from The Office as.
I watched it as always super buff, CIA guy versus nerdy office.
Yeah. Well, he's sort of there's bits where he's annoyed or he's interrogating a terrorist. And
have you ever seen any of his lip sync battle stuff as well?
No.
That's again in a whole other facet of what's his name? John
Krasinski.
Yeah. Anyway, we're not. Bless you, John. We're not
well,
here for you.
No.
But, so what was the title you were going with?
Well, I wanted to go with The Hunt for Grey Zone October, but it doesn't really work.
Yeah. I'm a fan of, I'm not, I don't know if it's, I did propose Oktoberfest.
Yes.
I'm not sure.
It's
if that has
winning
the same vibes that we're...
It's winning over the Hunt for Grey Zone October.
Put it to a vote. Let us know.
Yes.
All right. Well, do you want to? Why is this a significant month?
Well, I just think there's a bunch of sort of trend lines in the world that are almost converging at this moment, and there's a lot happening in the world geopolitically, economically, and there's a bunch of decisions and I think consequential things are going to happen over the next few weeks, into the beginning of November, which I think are just going to sort of set part of, I think, where we're going from here. We'll get a sense of where we're going in the midst of this grey zone unknownness.
Yeah, okay. All right. Do you want to kick us off?
Yes, we have a list.
With our top of our list. A country we're probably familiar with by now. Russia-Ukraine
war. Yes.
Great.
So I think basically we've hit sort of a turning point in the war in Ukraine. Obviously, we did an episode on the war in Ukraine early on, and it's caused tremendous implications, obviously for the people of Ukraine and Russia, but also has created economic effects in the world, geopolitical effects, supply chain effects, energy effects. And we had, recently in the last few weeks, a quite significant sort of Ukrainian advance where at the beginning of the war, when we were watching the war in the first days, you had sort of, Russian, sort of advanced light infantry, sort of, light armor infantry convoys going into sort of Kyiv, trying to take the airport. Didn't happen. At that stage, we're thinking the whole thing was going to fall.
Yep.
But now you've had this quite, significant Ukrainian advance and the pushing back of, Russian positions in the east of the country, which has caused, Putin to have to pivot. And Putin has pivoted doing something that Russia has done only a few times in history. One was in World War I and World War II, where he's entered into a partial mobilization, which in many ways is increasingly looking like a full mobilization of anyone with military experience.
Yeah.
Males 18 to 35, although they're picking up people who are older, who must enter the war. Up till now, the war has very much been fought by people from Russia's regions, outer regions, the East and the Caucasus, and also by many really ethnic minorities. People of different sort of cultures of Russia, which come from Mongol descent, and then in the Caucasus, a number of the sort of Muslim republics and Tatars and so on. So in many ways, they've been sort of bearing the sort of weight of fighting this war.
Yeah.
But what this has done is your sort of urban elites in places like Moscow and St. Petersburg all of a sudden now are drawn into the conflict. And we've seen huge amounts of young men leaving the country on planes, crossing borders, massive loss of population. So that's going to have a significant effect. I think it was Mark Galeotti made an interesting point, the Russia expert, where he said, what this says to us is that Putin is more worried about pleasing and keeping on side those to the right of him, his sort of right-wing nationalist, than he is with his sort of those to the more liberal left side of him. He more wants to keep sort of aggressive generals on side and people in the security services than he does, an IT professionals in St. Petersburg. So I think this tells us a couple of things, that Putin realizes, so far this has sort of been called a special operation. They haven't declared it as a war. Obviously, when you declare it as a war, you as a whole nation have to bear the brunt of that. When it's just a special operation, you don't have to. So this is going to have significant political implications for Putin going forward. And the mobilization, brings it home. Russia began to sort of withdraw from its incursion into Afghanistan when, the increasing sort of feedback from mothers and wives and girlfriends who had lost sons and husbands and boyfriends on the battlefields in Afghanistan, that started to have a political cost. And I think we're going to start to see that. But I think that when you hear about a significant Ukrainian advance, what is not necessarily going to happen is Putin's not going to go, I gave it a shot and I've lost, and let's go back into his shell. That this has, we don't know exactly which way this will go, but, people talking, is this going to have a political cost for Putin in terms of could he lose his leadership? If he does lose his leadership, he spent a lot of the last sort of 6-7 years coup-proofing himself with how he set up the security forces. But also he is more likely to be, I think, replaced by someone even to the right of him. People like Patrushev or the head of the Wagner group, Prigozhin, I think his name is, who are more hawkish than him. So also, if Russia did go into some sort of collapse, that's also going to have significant geopolitical implications. Who takes power? What will they be like? What will that mean for the world in terms of Russia, commanding the second biggest nuclear arsenal in the world, incredible resources and so on. You've also seen in the annexation of a number of the regions, which we just got the results in today. Shock horror, Russia. They've decided by 99% to become part of Russia.
Just quickly, who was facilitating those
elections?
Elections.
Referendum.
Referenda.
Is a
was that a Moscow-led thing or?
Yes, 100%. Yeah. So I mean, it's claimed that it's the local sort of Russian-aligned commanders of those regions, but very much the sort of apparatus of the Russian state has been behind them. So and all have amazingly, in one of the biggest electoral shocks in history, by about 99% chosen to become part of Russia. But what that does is it extends Russia's security umbrella. So if that is now Russian territory, that's different than if Ukraine is attacking Ukrainian territory. And what Russia has said that, they're threatening nuclear response, if therefore they're now seeing that as part of Russia as of today. So they're seeing that if Ukraine or the West attacks those parts, they will respond with nuclear weapons.
You're right. Okay.
Now, and probably that would be something like a tactical nuclear weapon, and which is a smaller nuclear weapon, which is still pretty devastating on the battlefield. However, there's different opinions on whether that will happen, but it's sort of now in the realms of possibility. And the second thing is, if that's not going to happen, I think what we're going to see is an escalation of Putin increasingly desperate, trying new things. And, we've just also seen in the news overnight what was described as unprecedented damage to the gas pipelines that go from Russia to Europe. Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 both have been significantly damaged overnight.
Yeah.
The Danish Prime Minister and the Swedish Foreign Minister both come out saying, it looks like sabotage. So, you're going to see more stuff like that, which then sort of moves into the, just a couple of implications around why I think this is going to be really, I'll put three implications why I think October is going to be significant. We're going to see which direction the war is going. And you're going to see a change in Russian tactics. They're going to take it up a notch or possibly collapse. All of that will have significant implications for the world and particularly for Europe. Secondly, you're going to see increasing kinds of, I guess part B of the first point is you're going to see increasing escalation, whether that's sabotage or whatever. I think the second thing is the energy war component of this for Europe. Winter hasn't begun, and already you're seeing the massive escalation of energy prices in the world because of the effects of this war, and we don't know what that's going to look like in Europe classically in sort of political science. When the cost of basic things like food and energy goes up, there's increased civil unrest and political unrest in countries. And you're going to have a very difficult winter for Europe coming up. And we haven't really entered that. Europe has had some quite unseasonably warm weather. But I think as that enters, that's going to be, a significant influence outside of just Europe, and not just in Europe, all across the world.
Yes.
And then the third thing is Russia did provide a kind of security umbrella for a number of its sort of neighbours. And it's interesting that we've just seen the hostilities and conflict which we had a couple of years ago between Azerbaijan and Armenia, which on the southern part of Russia, both former parts of the Soviet Union, they've been fighting again, and Azerbaijan has entered into Armenian territory. So you're looking at a war kicking off there. We also had some border skirmishes on the Kyrgyzstani-Turkmenistani border. So you could see not just Russia sort of take off, but really see war start to break out in those regions and spill over.
Okay.
The Serbian Prime Minister, I think, said a couple of days ago that, he said we're 2 months away from a significant, global conflict again, or world war in Europe has, the potential to spill over. Russia's talking about creating its own foreign legion. The Ukrainians have a foreign legion, of Serbs and Belarusians and different people who want to fight. There was even some reports today. Well, increasingly the Russians are using Iranian drones And, there was an Iranian drone sort of post operating in Ukraine that was hit by the Ukrainians, and there's claims that there were Iranians there. Do you see somewhere like Iran get dragged into this conflict?
Yeah.
So there's tremendous possibilities for things to spill over. But I think what we're going to see is the war as it's been up till now, you're going to see escalations, whatever that looks like, and I think increased unrest. So the next, I think, couple months, in particular October, is going to be an absolute turning point. Also, people want to move before winter. It's going to get very cold and, muddy and, so incredibly decisive months coming up in the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, well, just a quick one. I know maybe 2 weeks ago or so, we started to see this kind of turn in the war. Like it's almost like Ukraine starting to take back territory, and this is kind of prior to Putin's announcement. Is that still happening?
Yes.
Is the concern just about now heading into those other regions that are now pro-Moscow?
Yes.
What are we expecting in that?
So, you're continuing to see Ukrainian advances.
Yeah.
And Ukraine's sort of stated war objectives is to take back all the territory.
Yeah, okay.
That was part of Ukraine pre-2014. So there's an inevitable clash here coming between Ukraine, and it is having, it's obviously getting significant sort of weapons, both supply and training by NATO and other nations. So there's this sort of imbalance in terms of supply and logistics. And Russia, though, has a very different way of fighting war, and historically used large amounts of just sending troops forward and then massive artillery. I think it's you're going to see an intensification potentially of the war going forward.
Right. Okay. So that's updating Russia. Next up, the Brazil election.
Yeah, the Brazil election is something I've been sort of following of late. And, this is, people talk about, you think forward to say 2024 and the next US presidential election. Yeah. And obviously what happened on January the 6th and, a lot of conversation in the United States and around the world around, the acceptance of electoral results and so on. And many of these sort of things are swirling around in Brazil, which is becoming, extremely polarized in many similar ways to the United States. Basically, the current Brazilian president, Jair Bolsonaro, is facing his sort of, you'd almost say, nemesis, the leader of the Workers' Party, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, commonly known as Lula. So it's the sort of heavyweight bout between Bolsonaro and Lula. Lula was formerly president and went through a period where, Brazil did actually grow economically for a period there. There was sort of a high point for Brazil in both hosting the Rio Olympics and the World Cup.
Okay, so this is recent.
This is recent, and sort of coming into the early to mid 2000s.
Yeah.
And so Brazil went through this thing where it was, emerging as a significant, mid-level, powerful country, and it's a country with a significant population. Became, and you had an uptick as you sort of had development occur, and incomes went up and so on.
Sure.
But then the country, sort of got embroiled in, a significant corruption scandal, which was known as Operation Car Wash. And, different sort of corruption allegations came out against, Lula and the Workers' Party. Some people in Brazil see some of these as politicized.
Yeah.
And then what eventually happened was that Lula was placed in prison. So you imagine it this way. It's like if Trump or Biden had placed one of the others, or Hillary Clinton had been placed in prison, and then had been released, and then you had the rematch. That's what happened in Brazil.
Yeah.
So that's Lula. So Lula, interestingly too, just from a church perspective, Lula initially sort of had some engagement with the evangelical community, and you had some evangelicals vote for Lula, but then he was replaced by his sort of protege, Dilma, I think the last name's Rousseff. And then, you had this corruption scandal. You had a rise in crime. So there was a sense of significant, particularly amongst the sort of emerging middle classes, that there was this sort of uptick in crime. And you had this significant electoral backlash as this figure, Jair Bolsonaro, had sort of come with a lot of connections to Brazil's sort of army and military establishment, also police. And he's more, as people have described him as the sort of Trump of the tropics. He came to power. And, in many ways, this is the polarization of Brazilian politics, and it echoes some of the stuff from the previous Cold War and previous sort of military leadership. But in some ways also, it's also being sort of shaped with its own sort of take on the American culture wars that are going on. So they meet for an election. I think it begins at the beginning of October, maybe October the 2nd. I think it goes for a little period.
Okay.
But I think what's really interesting is this sort of global wave of populists. Jair Bolsonaro was a populist. In some ways also Lula was a populist, but you're seeing this sort of battle between the left and right populism at play here. And it's going to be really interesting because there's many people speculating that if Bolsonaro loses the election, he may not accept the results.
Yeah.
And in some ways with Trump, he's already, questioning that it could be sort of like faked or whatever. And then you've got these two candidates, one who's been in prison and there's sort of a corruption haze over one, other one there's sort of an anti-democratic haze over people Bolsonaro was actually stabbed during his electoral campaign previously, and I think someone was actually killed from the Workers' Party, just recently. So there's also the threat of violence is sort of hanging over this election. And I do wonder as well that in some ways, some of the tactics that may be adopted, as you see in the Brazilian election, could flow into particularly American politics going forward. There's been a lot of conversations between sort of both sides of Brazilian politics and America, and there's sort of, some shared populations going backwards and forwards. So I think particularly for South America, some of those things where South America is the home of populism, it really sort of, created as a political form, but you're seeing sort of the modern versions of this, and you're seeing this in Chile. You had a recent, attempted assassination of Kirchner, the sort of vice president in Argentina, by a group who are sort of alt-right. And then you've got a classic way people are wondering if even that was faked, So I think this election is going to be, one of the most important elections this year, but also, we're going to see the continued future direction of what sort of particularly right-wing populism looks in the world in this global movement.
Okay. I was going to ask, what's the kind of global impacts of this, but
I think one of the things that are really interesting is you have seen, whilst there's very local realities in a thing like the Brazilian election, and you don't want to just the worst way to read global politics is to look at it through the prism of American domestic politics. But then there has been this sort of weirdly of these right-wing nationalists, there's a globalist dimension, so you see people like, Viktor Orban, Modi in India, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, there's sort of communication between them, and they saw themselves as a sort of forefront of vanguard, pushing back on what they see as this sort of globalist, liberal agenda in the world. So I think it's of international importance because Brazil is a very important country.
Yeah.
I also think it's interesting for the church as well, because just as you've seen the church polarized, Reuters had an article today about how this is also causing polarization in the evangelical church.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think it's also another example alongside the United States how churches can become extremely polarized when you're in the sort of milieu of populist politics.
All right. Okay. So gone Russia, Brazil election. Next up, we've got China. Kind of dancing around the world here.
China is all eyes on China in October, because what we have is the 20th Party Congress of the Chinese Communist Party.
Okay.
So China's obviously not a democracy. And what you have is these party congresses where the Chinese Communist Party, which is the party which runs China, has these congresses. Now, to understand what's going to happen is you need to understand a little bit of history.
Please.
So you had in Chinese history in the 20th century, probably the most significant figure in Chinese political history, which is Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong was the leader of China, and he sort of, was the guerrilla fighter and emerged to sort of create the modern Chinese state as we understand it, led the Chinese Party. In many ways, you could argue he invented modern guerrilla warfare, and then led China on this quest to become, sort of this, world power. He, near the end, lived through some quite traumatic times. One was the sort of agricultural and economic sort of central command, Soviet-style politics he put in play, where he, sort of created one of the worst famines, where tens of millions of people died. Yeah. And, more people died from Mao's hand than Stalin and Hitler. And then also he presided over a period of tremendous cultural tumult where in many ways there were sort of forces moving against him in his own party, and he unleashed the young in what's known as the Cultural Revolution. And so you had this massive ideological culture war. You could also call it a civil war. And he released these young Red Guards. And so it was this period of tremendous sort of chaos. Mao passed. And then it went into similar what happened in the Soviet Union when Stalin died and you had the rise of Khrushchev. You went into this period where after this tremendous chaos, there was sort of a consolidation. And the party actually released a sort of very obscurely titled paper, I can't remember what it was called, almost apologizing for the Cultural Revolution.
Right.
And the sort of reformist, and look, he's a reformer. He still was a communist and leader of the Communist Party. But a figure named Deng Xiaoping came in and he wanted to stop this happening in China again. And, in Chinese politics, there's very much this sort of, understanding that chaos is something to be avoided. China's struggled through tremendous periods of chaos in the past and almost politically, theologically has this idea of sort of, when there's peace in heaven, peace on earth is linked to peace in heaven.
Sure.
They created this system where you could not have another cult of personality, another dictator to just lead for life.
Yeah.
So he didn't bring in democracy, but he did two things. Number one, he began to bring in market reforms. So he changed the economy, and the expansion of China as a modern day economic powerhouse, as we understand it, really began with Deng Xiaoping's reforms that he began sort of at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s.
Yeah, okay, I was going to ask. Okay.
Yeah.
70s,
and China goes from a sort of underdeveloped country to the economic juggernaut it is today. Like a city, like Shenzhen, you have these places which were like swamps, in the early 80s, so are now these massive,
I remember
incredible.
seeing like pictures of, it was like Beijing or something like in the early 90s or something versus now.
Yes.
And it's just kind of this like low-lying kind of suburban type of thing to this huge city, skyscrapers.
Incredible. And you've seen this migration of people from the center of or inland in the country to the coastal cities.
Yeah.
And what that's also done is that changed the world because it integrated into the world this manufacturing base, which could make things very cheap, and this massive workforce of people who were going to work in manufacturing. That created offshoring. So all of a sudden it was cheaper for an American or an Australian or a British or a French manufacturer to get it made in China than to be made in those countries. And in many ways that sort of created some of the populist backlash that we were just talking about, where the Rust Belt in, say, the United States, many of those jobs were lost, which then ended up going from Democrat to voting Republican, happened because of offshoring. And it made everything cheap. If you look at, say, what a TV and VCR cost in 1988.
Good year.
Good year. It's not much different to say what's actually, like the price has been kept quite low and competitive on goods. I mean, our iPhones, everything are cheap because they've been made in China. So Deng Xiaoping introduced these incredible economic reforms, which didn't just change China, it changed the world.
Yeah.
But the second thing he did was he created this system where you couldn't have one dictator. You had the party would vote on decide on a leader.
Yeah, okay.
And there'd be set terms. So they could only, I think it was 2 terms they could be leader for. So, you had Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao. When they finished, that sort of 2 previous leaders, when they came to the end of their period of office, they then were removed. And this was to stop another cult of personality, another dictator.
Yeah. Just to clarify, there was only one party at this time. There wasn't.
There's only one party.
There's only one party.
Yes.
Good to know.
Yeah. There's only one party. So then the Party Congress previously then put to the leader of the party. And it's interesting in China because it's not like there's a clear president. There's these different titles like the party president and core leader, and even Deng Xiaoping moved around these different sort of leadership positions. But effectively, what's going to happen at the 20th Party Congress, and it's already been prefaced, everyone's expecting this to happen, is that Xi Jinping will make himself the leader for life. So he's getting rid of the
like two-term kind of
two-term thing that Deng Xiaoping put in to stop a cult of personality, and very much so. You're seeing the rebirth of the cult of personality with Xi. I remember being at I think it was Gold Coast Airport or Brisbane Airport in Queensland, and walking past the bookstore at the airport, and on this display at the front they had these copies of Xi Jinping Thought, which is just fascinating. And so you're seeing him as almost portraying himself as that kind of leader. Now, a couple of things interesting about Xi is, number one, he's much more based around foreign policy and rebirthing of China and nationalism, and even linked, I would say, some ethnic elements of that. So you're almost creating a sort of ethno-nationalism. We talked about civilizational states last week. That's very much what Xi is building. And then secondly, he's not into the economy in the same way. And actually also what's going to happen at this, he sees that the economy that was being built is creating a danger for China. That actually the sort of wealth and the success of the reforms that Deng Xiaoping put into place is actually now has the potential to unseat the party. So what you got to see is with communism, and particularly in China, is Marxist-Leninism was all about the party staying in power. So they were prepared to change the economy, but they wanted to keep the party structure. So he now sees that that's gone on long enough, and that there's a threat to the party structure because people are getting more money, they're becoming more individualistic. This means China as an international power is going to be less competitive militarily. You're seeing things like, military sort of education happening in primary schools, the banning of computer games, foreign luxury goods being banned. You're seeing this very much, this model he's building where China can be more assertive in the world. And in terms of foreign policy, you've seen this with Hong Kong. You've seen this with Taiwan. And one of the sort of key things that Xi is doing is also staking his political legitimacy on the retaking of Taiwan, which China sees as a province that needs to be reunified, even though Taiwan sees itself as a separate country. So that happens, and it's all on because, US, Joe Biden said the other day that they would defend militarily Taiwan. But the other thing that's happening is what people need to understand is you're seeing Xi at the Party Congress is moving out some of the more technocratic economic sort of leaders who have been the architects of China's, economic growth, and he's moving more people who are more aligned with more traditional socialist sort of economy. So this is going to have a tremendous effect for the global economy. So the world that China built of cheap stuff that we've all enjoyed and the economic model of the world, that is going to change with what happens at this Party Congress. So Xi's not going anywhere. You've got a assertive Chinese premier changing the economic model, and geopolitically is much more assertive. Deng Xiaoping always had this thing of more hiding your strength and sort of being very patient. And it was almost like the competition with the United States was to wait until China was really strong. But Xi's just racing ahead with that at this point in time. So Xi as leader for life and the new economic and geopolitical models he will adopt is going to have a significant effect for the entire world.
Okay. So it's almost as if the kind of the unrest that's been talked about and things that kind of the way the pot's been stirred over the last few years, and as people have talked about China, what's happening there, it's almost like there was a bit of a safety valve in that Xi could move on and someone else could come up. But that's kind of that this trajectory could actually play out.
Yes.
Now that if he stays in.
Oh, totally. It's going to be a very different world.
Okay.
And also, China enters the culture wars. China's, there's a lot of talk about Russia and Russiagate and Russia influencing the American election and Brexit and so on. China's a much bigger player and is already, across the world, involved in things. so is the West. But again, you're going to see an increasingly competitive, contested global space.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So moving from China to the UK.
Yeah. We spoke last week about the obvious sort of end of an era, the second Elizabethan era, with the passing of Queen Elizabeth II, and now the ascension of Charles III. But in many ways, I think this also marks a tremendous, grey zone moment for the United Kingdom. And obviously, the Queen has been this figure of stability, so that's come to an end, but also an incredibly challenging, economic period for Britain as it, moves through the implications of Brexit, but also the energy crisis, which has hit the whole of Europe and large parts of the world. But one thing to note was this week's really interesting, or it was in the last 10 days, basically you've got your annual budget that governments have, and, we have that in the Westminster system. And the British government, new Prime Minister coming in after Boris left, which honestly, Boris leaving over Partygate seems like a lifetime ago.
Yeah.
Like Boris, like he's now, it feels like it's 10 years ago. So much has happened. Liz Truss has come in, and Liz Truss has replaced Boris as the leader of the Conservative Party. Just a point on Liz Truss. I can do whatever I want. It's rebuild.
I actually don't know much about her.
Okay,
so feel free to educate me.
So Liz Truss, fascinatingly, in her early 20s was in a very different political space. So she's now the leader of the Conservative Party, but she was actually sort of an up-and-coming star in the sort of third party in Britain, the Liberal Democrats. And what's so interesting is often one thing, what Liz Truss, I won't go into an entire history of Liz Truss here, but one of the things that Liz Truss shows us is one of the predictions you often hear is young people believe this, so the inevitability is when they're adults, that change that they believe now at 21 will then happen to the entire culture at 45 when they move into power.
Yeah.
There's footage of Liz Truss I think it was in the 80s or early 90s at the Liberal Democrat conference, and she's talking about abolishing the monarchy, like passionately abolishing the monarchy. Fast forward to the royal funeral, and there she is giving a biblical reading at the funeral of the Queen. And so Liz Truss goes on a political journey, as many people do, changes her opinions on things, and now is the leader of the Conservative Party. So for this up-and-coming sort of young idealistic firebrand in the Liberal Democrats wanting to abolish the monarchy to now the leader of the Conservative Party. And that tells us that people change their views. Yes. So anytime anyone says, when the young people get into power, they're going to believe this. No, people believe different things at 45 to what they believe at 21 and then at 78. So that's just a little instructive thing of Liz Truss. But Liz Truss comes in the Conservative Party, but very much with Kwasi Kwarteng, her Chancellor of the Exchequer or Treasurer, then have really, I think, extended what they see their vision for Britain is, which is a sort of particular economic model with very low taxes, hoping to stimulate the economy. So they did this mini budget, and Kwasi Kwarteng did these tax cuts, which almost got sort of gasps of shock in the House when of Commons when they were announced, because they're sort of the most radical tax cuts since the early 1970s. But what's fascinating is you've got two things happening simultaneously, and this also tells a story about the global economy. You've got inflation going up.
Yep.
So we just talked about the economy with China, but what you've got since COVID and the stimulus that was released, we'll go back to the financial crisis, you had stimulus released into the economy to try and make us grow when there's a problem. So imagine this is like antibiotics. It's like you go to the doctor, you get antibiotics, that's stimulus. You print money, more money, you give it to people, they buy stuff, that gets the economy going. Then, you have that at the GFC. When COVID happens, we have another whole bunch of stimulus because people couldn't work and all of a sudden people are paid and they're paid for not doing anything. This releases more money, prints more money. So it's like you were sick once, gave you antibiotics. You're sick again, we're going to give you antibiotics. But the problem is that antibiotics has a side effect, and stimulus has a side effect of creating inflation. So what central banks, which are like the US Fed or the Bank of England or the Reserve Bank of Australia, they are separate to government and they try and control the speed of the economy. So one way that they see that inflation's getting high because the economy's moving too fast, they then try and slow things down by raising interest rates.
Yep.
Now, we've been in this really weird economic space, for a couple of decades now where it's been really hard to make things grow. Now, I would say part of that growth was also when you go back and look at that story of China, and a lot of growth in the world happened because China was investing and building stuff and releasing money when the West didn't have money.
Yep.
But we've been in this very low growth period. So one of the ways that they tried to fix that was making interest rates, what it was to borrow money, really low.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got people now who are, say, in their late 30s, who all they've ever known is low interest rates.
Yep.
So you want to borrow money for a house, you want to borrow money for a car, your credit card, whatever, it's quite low. That's to encourage you to spend money. There's no impetus to save because you just borrow money.
Well, I remember there was even some, was it last year or a couple of years ago, like some European countries that were actually charging interest to save. Like,
yeah, I think Denmark, it was like 0. I think Japan was really low.
Yeah.
So that was the goal. But then what happened was inflation kicks off. You got stimulus, and then particularly after COVID, inflation starts to go up.
Yeah.
So that means you're not earning any more, but stuff is costing more.
Yes.
Now, get back to the early 90s. So we had a small recession here in Victoria, and interest rates got up to like 17% or 14%. Now, we're not in that place, but the difference between now and then is people have borrowed so much more money. People have just seen cheap money. Let's just borrow. So we've got this credit card generation in the world. And I don't just mean that as a slight against younger people. It's many ages.
Yep.
And almost there's been a little bit of a fantasy that we can just have what we want. You want to go on that holiday. Everything has been discounted. Your Uber is discounted. Netflix does not make profit. Ryanair, AirAsia, all these discount air travelers. It's all this economic model which is now starting to fall over.
Yeah, okay.
So what happens is central banks realize that inflation's going up, so we need to slow this thing down. So the way that we do that is to raise interest rates. And so they've been sort of slowly doing that, aggressively doing that. The European Central Bank, Bank of England, mostly everyone follows the Fed in the US. But what's fascinating happening in England is the Bank of England has been following what the Fed has been doing. So the Bank of England is trying to slow the economy down. Now, that's not popular.
No.
Because what you're effectively trying to do is crash the economy, because economists would argue that actually you need to have recessions at certain times to reset.
Yeah, okay.
To bring things back to normal so that, prices and wages and employment, all these things reset to a healthy level.
Yep.
So effectively what the Fed is doing, and this is another way that this is because the Fed also is going to continually to sort of aggressively raise interest rates.
Yep.
This is why the next couple of months are hugely important in the world, is what the Fed is trying to do is effectively lead us into a recession. Now, what they will say is, we want a soft landing. We want to do all this and not create a recession. But most people have the sense that this is going to create a recession. So you look at things like the Great Resignation of I can just leave my job and go get another. That may be true now in September, but come January, if employment goes up and we hit a recession, you're going to want to hold on to your job because you may not have it. You may not have another job to go to.
Yes.
So back to Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss's budget, what's fascinating is central banks raising interest rates. That is unpopular, but they're not elected, so they don't care. Then you've got politicians like the Conservative Party who realize that they need to beat Labor. So they realize in some senses that that's going to be unpopular. So what they do is all these tax cuts in order to stimulate the economy.
Yeah,
so Britain's in this strange position, and I think it's instructive not just for Britain, but I think you're going to see this around the world. This is the dilemma for politicians and central banks, is that it's like putting the accelerator on and the brakes at the same time. The central banks are putting the brakes on, and then the British government's putting the accelerator on. And as you and I know, that's how you do an epic donut standstill. Lots of smoke.
As you and I know. We don't know that. We're just guessing.
Yes. So what's happened is the pound has absolutely plummeted to record low levels. You're also seeing the euro plummet. The yen is plummeting. So these are just, and we could talk for hours about the economy, but effectively these are significant warning signs that some of the stuff's happening in the economy now in 2023 is going to start to play out. So you look at the energy crisis, war in Ukraine, continued environmental extreme events. I think as we're recording, there's a significant hurricane heading towards Florida, which will have significant, obviously human effects, but also economic effects.
Yeah.
And as someone said too, what happens when a massive hurricane hits Florida, but it takes you 5 months because of supply chain issues to replace all that stuff. So the story of the economy, I think, is going to be set in the next few months for what the next few years will look like.
Yeah, well, okay.
And for Britain, it's just, and I think that this period is going to be intensified grey zone for the United Kingdom.
Yeah, okay. All right. On to Italy.
Italia. So we had the electoral victory of a coalition of right-wing parties, which has gotten a lot of international coverage. Italian politics is somewhat chaotic at times, and there's lots of different parties, and people can sort of, zone out because they don't understand it all. But it's sort of broken through into the international media because what's happened is there's a coalition of 3 right-wing parties. One, the Lega Nord, which is led by Matteo Salvini, who's one of those sort of populists in the sort of like grouping of Jair Bolsonaro, Donald Trump, Modi. Yep. And that was a new sort of anti-establishment party that was created over the last few years as we've seen that electoral backlash across the world. He did an alliance with an older right-wing party, the Forza Italia party with Silvio Berlusconi, who has been a figure in Italian politics for some time, but they had an alliance this time with another party called the Fratelli. Is it Italia? I can't remember the Brothers of Italy, and that's an older party which has sort of fascist roots.
Okay.
So the leader of that party has become the new Italian prime minister, and it's Italy's first female prime minister, Giorgia Meloni. And she has replaced Mario Draghi, who is the prime minister. Now, this is the first time Italy's had some people are describing as a fascist prime minister since Mussolini in the war.
Yeah, wow.
Now, this is really interesting because what you're seeing is a kind of different political tide in Europe than other parts of the world. Some of the commentary often in the United States, in let's say the English-speaking world, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Britain, America, is that it's the older types who are voting for your Trumps or Brexit. But what we're seeing in continental Europe is that in places like France, those who voted for the far left and the far right were actually the young, and those voting for the centre, Macron, were actually older, the boomers. And so we just saw a few weeks ago in Sweden, really good. I'm not saying good in a moral sense, but very strong electoral showing by the Sweden Democrats Party, which is another sort of neo-fascist party. So the fact that you're seeing the emergence already at this time of sort of neo-fascist or formerly fascist parties, however you want to describe them in Europe, is significant. Mario Draghi, the Italian Prime Minister, was very much the sort of centrist, I think he was head of sort of the European Economic Commission or whatever, sort of like centrist, neoliberal economist, and you're seeing this massive backlash against that. Now, is this the return of fascism? There was an interesting article in Le Monde in the last couple of days where it said it's not the return of fascism. What Meloni is doing is creating almost this new kind of politics, which is sort of, interestingly, she, despite sort of being on this, it's called the far right, she's very supportive of Ukraine, very pro-NATO, unlike her two partners in her partnership, Berlusconi and Salvini. And they said, Le Monde said, this is a new kind of European politics, which is pro-NATO, pro sort of the state doing lots. So that's not conservative. But then also, pushing back on what some people would describe as some of the woke issues, like, children and trans and those sort of issues. So it's interesting seeing Europe heading in this direction. We haven't had the winter of discontent yet. So I think the European electoral map, when we sort of head into midpoint of next year, is going to be extremely interesting. But I think that this may be a showing that people are, one point, so to make a sub point on that, what's interesting is her two partners, Berlusconi and Salvini, got a lot less lower votes than they were expecting. Salvini was previously seen as the anti-establishment figure, but now people are turning on him within a few years, and Meloni. So part of the message is to your former anti-establishment people who were popular 3 or 4 years ago, there are new figures who possibly could overtake. And again, too, this sort of brings us to the midterms. In the US, that you're seeing sort of like people like Rupert Murdoch, who backed Donald Trump, now sort of moving his support to a figure like DeSantis, is the governor of Florida. And what people may think could be a battle between Biden and Trump in 2024 actually could be sort of the next rung of these people, and an intensification of these trends is sort of where possibly I think the Italian election is showing a bigger story for what is relevant to the world.
Yeah, right. Okay. Next up, we've got Iran.
Iran is currently in the midst of some significant protest movements. So what happened, again, Iran is an incredibly important country in the world, a very large country, has tremendous significance in its geopolitical position, one of the world's largest producers of oil. Probably the sort of leading country in Shia Islam, but also a significant influence in beyond just the Shia countries and in the Muslim world, and has sort of been involved in a sort of battle with the West for some time, particularly since 1979, when there was the Islamic fundamentalist revolution occurred in Iran, and you had this sort of quite austere form of Islam with the sort of Ayatollahs take over the country. And so what happened this week or in the last last 10 days was that a young woman from the Kurdish regions, Mahsa Amini, came into Tehran and was wearing her hijab, her veil, loosely. And this is often what young women will do who are rebelling a little bit in Iran. They wear their veil a bit back on their head, showing the front of the hair. But there is a group that is called the Morality Police, and they took her into custody for immoral dress, and she was beaten in custody and lost her life. Yeah. Now, this sparked a significant protest movement, which began with a lot of young women and women leading this against the mandatory enforcement of the hijab. But then it sort of coalesced with a bunch of other issues in Iran, from the nature of the government full stop to the rising inflation we've been talking about in this, the energy crisis that's happening in places like Iran, in Ukraine, but also to the ongoing sanctions against Iran because of their support of different terrorists and terrorist groups like Hezbollah. So this is a really, really crucial time for Iran. And which way Iran goes will have an effect on the rest of the world. If the Iranian government falls, what kind of government will replace? There is a lot of the West who will be, hoping that the government of Iran falls and is replaced by a more liberal and democratic government. Whether that will happen, we're not sure. We saw what happened in the Arab Spring in 2011, when there was a significant uprising against, particularly President Mubarak in Egypt, and there was a lot of liberal Democrats and young people got involved, but then eventually the Muslim Brotherhood ended up taking power. So what is going to happen in Iran is really key. Also, if you look at what happened with food, what's happening with food prices in the world at this time, the food prices in the Middle East went through a crisis in 2011, which was part of the factors which led to the Arab Spring. We're seeing that happening again in the world. So what this is going to politically mean for Iran, this has implications for Israel, this has implications for Iraq, Syria, all the countries around it, for the United States. Yes. So this is hugely important for the direction of Iran at this point in time. And for those who would like to hear more about the church in Iran, go back and listen to our interview with David Yeganatsa from a couple of weeks ago. But hugely significant for Iran, for the Iranian people, for the Iranian diaspora. But through the lens of this, hugely important for the geopolitical global order, and another really massive thing that's happening this October. Yeah.
And just a thought, like you kind of mentioned it there a bit, like in all of these things, like I think some of these nations we've talked about are all like big nations and significant contributors to the global economy or food supply chain, all this kind of stuff. So it's almost like these countries are facing significant crises.
Yes.
But also, what's the flow-on effect of that to,
Yes.
like there is, I think, a place like Yemen. Like,
Yes.
what's the flow-on effect to these other places as well that actually these become catalysts for something bigger as well?
Well, often what you see in smaller countries is proxy wars and struggles.
Yeah.
So Yemen, in many ways, there's a proxy war between the Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and then Iran with the Houthi rebels. And so Yemen becomes this battlefield between the two.
Yeah.
And in some ways, that's also Ukraine. Ukraine is a battlefield between NATO and Russia, and also Iran, and some might even say China. And so you see these countries where these conflicts play out. Lebanon, which has gone through tremendous suffering, like incredibly suffering in terms of economic. A lot of the banks in Beirut have been shut because people are trying to get their money out because of inflation, food costs. You go back to the terrible explosion that happened in the port of Lebanon. Lebanon's, was a much more stable country, but because of things like Hezbollah, what happens in Palestine and different places like that, it creates destabilization for other countries. And you think of, us down under Australia, New Zealand, these things have flow-on effects. What happens in China, Australia's wealth and in many ways New Zealand's wealth is we've gotten a lot of wealth from the commodities boom and agriculture and stuff and dairy products that have gone into other countries in the world. That has a flow-on effect to us. Currency fluctuations, energy, all of this has tremendous flow-on effects. So, to sort of summarize all of this, grey zone, maybe we've sort of been entering into grey zone, but October's a little bit of a turning point. I don't know exactly where all this goes, but what I do know is we're in the midst of even more significant changes, which means that normal as we understood it is not coming back anytime soon. And perhaps we're just moving to what the world's always been. This is the normal of the world. But this is a time to be praying. This is a time to expect the material conditions in the world to change and disruption to be normative for some period. But be praying in October for the world. And I just think as well, on Sunday, we, in our service, really ran it in a way that was outward. We had part of the interview with David Yeganatsa. We did a little extra interview and we shared that in our service and talked about what was happening in Iran. And we had different elements to the service. Brit's one of our team, she at the end got us to stand and actually say out loud together as the entire congregation of a nation in the world that we were was on our heart that we wanted to pray for. And we faced outwards, to the back of the auditorium, to the sides of the auditorium. So I think at this moment, after coming through COVID and all the disruption, we can face inward. And there is internal work that God wants to do in us, and personal renewal leads to corporate change. But there's also, I think, a key to get people's eyes bigger, even beyond the culture wars, to what's happening geopolitically in our world. And I think leaders need to have a global vision at this time.
Yeah, that's good. Is there anything else before we wrap up, or happy to close this off there?
I think we have given them more than enough details and intricacies of Italian politics.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, Mark, for exploring that for us and your diligence in keeping up to date with what's happening around the world. But encouragement to you guys. Please continue to contend and pray and intercede for our world, for these nations, for your nation. If you would like to find out a bit more, support us, you can head to rebuilders.co, and we're going to do subscriber chats. We'll explore some of these things a bit further, so you can sign up to the mailing list there to get those as well. So anyway, thank you, Mark. Miss you, Liddy, and we'll catch you next time.